Hello and welcome to my tutorial. You know it's my tutorial because it says so right on the screen. If you've read the article that accompanies this video, well, you probably know what's going on already. If you haven't, I highly suggest you go check it out. It's on the internet. You can find it. Anyway, I'm just going to grab some entertainment. I've loaded up a long Winamp playlist, and I have an episode of House playing. First, I'm going to show you how I set up my layers for texturing. I use a suite of scripts called VTools, which, among other handy things, comes with a quick PSD exporter script that makes TGAs from groups. I have it set to set save all append initial. I have the root layer set marker to tilde. I have alpha channels set to associate with marked sets. Most of the rest of it's default, but make sure you turn off leave TGAs open after saving. It gets annoying. The other script included is quick Save Psd, I believe, and that basically takes your saved settings from your Save Psd dialog and allows you to bind it to a hotkey so you can save all your maps at the same time, which is helpful. Right, so I've got my model open now in 3D Studio Max 2011, and I have set it up with a very basic Zolial shader. It's not anything fancy right now, but it will be later. You can see here that I'm actually turning pretty much everything off right now, and that's because I want to make sure everything looks good with just one Omni, and all the maps just set very basically before I put any kind of crazy shader efforts into it. I've already done the quick save PSD script, so it saved all my maps, and I've inputted those all into their appropriate boxes in the shader. What I'm doing now is I'm actually using Text Tools, which is a great suite of scripts from NGHS, and I've set my map size to 2048 by 2048, and I've rendered out what's known as a blockout map, which takes every element of the model, in this case the low poly model, and assigns a different color to it and bakes it out. This is very useful if your UV map is very delicately packed, which it shouldn't be, but if it is, you can use Magic Wand to select the color from the elements you want, and if the rest of it's scattered all over the place, just hit select similar, and it'll select the rest of the element, which is extremely useful. I've just put this layer underneath everything so it's there when I need it. Right, so now you can see I've begun making groups per material that are going to be on the model. So this one's called plastic, and it's just in my diffuse layer for now because I'm blocking everything out. I've dragged in a photo of the surface that I want to create. And to very quickly get the selection for the area that I want to make that material, I just went down to my quick selection layer and I used Magic Wand and deselected the parts I didn't want to select, and there you have it. There I've got the selection. And I've used that selection to make a mask for this material's group. This allows me to be super sloppy within this group, and it'll still come out with perfectly clean edges because it's all masked off. Now I've just dragged my photo base into the group directly, and to remove some of the light gradients coming from the photo, I'm just using dodge and burn to kind of remove the gradients in this very specific area. Definitely play around with this here, because oftentimes if you remove too much photoiness, it'll end up looking kind of computer graphics-y, gamey, not good. Definitely play around with it, leave some of that grime in. Now usually when I start a texture, I start out by making materials. What I mean by that is I want to see what all of this is going to look like together with the specular, the diffuse, and the normal map, and the gloss map. Notice I said gloss map, it's very important. I like to see how that all works together before I really go and commit to making this material. Now obviously I've already made a paint over, or there's been concept art or something, as I've said in my article that goes along with this video, but I want to see how everything acts together in real time, like for realsies. I have this perfect vision of the finished product in my head, but I want to see if that can actually be achieved realistically with the technology that we've got. And before I commit to making this and I get it finished and I say, wait, this looks terrible. So if you've been watching this video and not paying attention to me ramble on, you probably noticed that I've duplicated my diffuse group for the plastic and put it in the specular and the gloss map. And I've moved the layer around, and I've changed the color, and I've changed the levels, and things like that. And I'm just trying to get that sense of what it's going to look like. And you can see there, it looks fairly close to the source. I'm going to give it a little bit of artistic representation because having things that have no specular look pretty ugly, so I'm going to give it some specular something. Because see, yes, I have the perfect vision of the material in my head, but realistically, having such a matte material go along with all these shiny high-tech future things, it looks a little bit out of place. So now that I know that my perfect vision in my head doesn't work quite the same way that I thought it would, now I can make those changes and I can get something that looks a little bit more in line with the environment and the rest of the materials on the model. Now, at the very start when I began making this material, I totally forgot to copy the black background layers that I had underneath everything and put them in all the layer groups. So when I was using the script to export all my maps, only the diffuse would have a black background layer, everything else was this gray or something, as you can see right there. So having the rest of the model be flat black gives me more contrast and I can see the material better. It's the same reason why I use the dark 3D Studio Max skin while texturing. So I brought up my photo there and I just hovered around the area that I thought looks really cool from the photo, and I really want to try and bring that into just the specular map or just the diffuse map. Try and get some of that stuff looking really nice and active. The real material has all these scuffs and these strange looking water droplets or spit marks or something, and they react great when they hit the light. And I know this for a fact because, I mean, I have a smartphone and I've got this same exact laptop actually that's in the photo. The IBM ThinkPad T22, there's nothing like it. It's amazing. Real PCs. Windows 98. So now I'm just using Clone Stamp to move around the unique details that are from this photo. Make them look a little bit more attractive, I guess. And there's quite a lot of unique details, and I'm definitely going to be bringing those out later. Now I've opened levels, and I'm using it to over contrast and really bring out the noise and the unique details from the photo on just my specular map. Notice on my diffuse how much more plain it looks, and I'm going to actually make it more plain. And I've saved it out, and look how cool that is. And the awesome thing about making things only in the gloss and the specular map is just how they react to the light. How when it's in engine or in a model viewer or something, when you move the model around, those details that are in the gloss and the spec really actually react to the light instead of just being there all the time, and it looks so cool. So here I'm just, checking in on House, seeing how he's doing, and, gotta have my entertainment. I mean, it wouldn't be any kind of good if I got bored making these videos, would it? Now here I've duplicated my diffuse map plastic base and put it into the gloss, and I've edited it just a little bit to show how it's going to react towards the end to get that proper gloss level going. And you see I'm definitely want that to be less glossy than the rest of the materials, in line with what the photos show, is that this material is not super glossy. So obviously the gloss map should be dark. It's a simple observation, my friends. And I'm going to need to adjust the shader in the end for this to make it look properly and act with the rest of the materials, which are going to be relatively high gloss compared to this material. Oh, something's happening. Oh, there's a person there. Oh, snap. Okay, back to what I was doing. The other thing which I forgot to note about the gloss map earlier is that I actually have a hue saturation layer above everything in that group, and it's set to saturation -100, so completely desaturated. That's because, yes, while there are certain situations, like with the 3-point shader, where you can use a color gloss map and it will do awesome things, realistically, in a production situation, you're probably only going to be allowed to use the alpha of an existing texture like the normal map or the specular map. And of course, that is if you're even allowed to use the gloss map at all. Anyway, Now what I'm doing is I'm adding some unique details to my gloss map. Some fingerprints that were just using a scattered brush. And I'm just going to play around with some of the layer styles. I want to make them brighter than the surface so they look oily. Like somebody was using this while they had water on their fingers, or they're eating French fries, or, you know, something that would make their hands wet. Now I know that fingerprints are almost as cliche as useless tape on models. I think that making them look bright and warp those highlights should give it some sort of interest rather than just being a flat black texture. Now, here what I've done is I've searched through my library, my huge library of photos, and I found one that looks kind of noisy but also has like almost a fade to it. And I'm going to put this on the back of the grip where your palm would go. Because think about it, your palm has the most surface area contacting the handle out of all of your hand. So, on the back where your palm is going to be contacting it, I want that pretty much solid high gloss like the fingerprints, because, you know, your hand is all wet, it's grabbing onto the handle, and what's going to make the most contact to the handle is going to be the palm of your hand. And that's really the kind of logic that you really need to be thinking about when you're placing your details onto the texture. Where if you have that kind of story made up for your thing, and everything kind of ties into each other, it's going to make your textures look infinitely more believable because they have some sort of story to them. And they're not just your artist's interpretation of whatever's popping into your mind. Everything logically needs to make some sort of sense, even if it's a little bit warped from the truth. Right, so now I've applied my texture to my model. I've saved it all out using the quick PSD, and I'm now adjusting the glossiness levels so that they look a little bit closer to what I was expecting. Now, because I was using Blend If for that photo overlay on the back where the palm grips, I could not adjust the lightness using conventional methods because it would just mess up the Blend If settings. So what I did to circumvent this is I made a blank layer underneath that Blend If layer, and then I used merge layers to merge the Blend If layer with the new blank layer, and that will give me a transparent version of that Blend If layer, and it's all merged down. So then I can use conventional methods to adjust the brightness and contrast and all that kind of stuff. I can color it, I can do whatever I want to it now. Now I'm pretty happy with this material so far, but I think this looks a step above what I just had. I've done some cleanup, some minor material tweaks, not a whole lot, but I think the shapes are a lot clearer, and overall it's less messy than what I had before. And I know there are always people out there who complain whenever I cut things out like that, but if you've been paying any attention at all to what I've been trying to teach you, showing you those parts would just be boring and repetitive. Those complainers just want to be spoon-fed, and they won't truly learn that way. Just pay attention, please. So now I've switched my source of entertainment over to the Giant Bombcasts. I've got to keep entertained while I'm entertaining you, or else you won't be entertained because I won't be entertained. Notice the pattern there, it's a chain. Anyway, so now I'm just sorting through, closing all my old photos that I had laying around. If you notice, my plastic is now much more saturated and a little bit lighter. A tiny bit. I think it's like +1 on the brightness contrast slider. But it's a lot more saturated, and that plays really well with the rest of the maps. It gives a whole dynamic to it and gives a lot of color. I've created a group for my next material, which is brushed metal, which is used pretty predominantly throughout this entire asset. It will look really, really cool once it's done. It looks so active when you combine the gloss with the specular map and a very, very blank diffuse map. It just looks so active. It plays great in the light. Now, I have a photo here which is going to be perfect for the brushed metal pattern. I like to use photos for brushed metal alongside the classic old school filter method of using noise plus motion blur, because I think once everything's set up and all the shaders are configured, I don't think any of the artificiality from the filter is going to be left, because you're going to be mixing that so much with the photo. So now that I've made a new layer with noise, I'm using motion blur on a fairly high setting to generate the brushed pattern in a flowed kind of way. What I mean by flowed kind of way is you can see how the brush pattern is going along with the flow of the parts, as if they're being machined. Now, when brushed materials are being made, the brushed pattern, if you notice, will almost always go in the flow of the material, as in it'll go in that direction. It won't necessarily curve with it or anything, but it'll have that general direction. And so I've used selections to selectively use motion blur and direct the flow the way I want them to go. Here I've started making my diffuse map for the brushed metal material. I have added the brushed strokes on multiply very, very, very faintly to represent shadows, I guess that you could say. Some kind of logic, anything. And I have put that on top of a metal base, of which I've got many for variety's sake and for, being handy. I have also, on that, started to add some color to it. You can see I have a color overlay in the layer style, set to a very faint blue. Not a whole lot. I just kind of want something. I've duplicated the brushed metal group and put it into the specular map. I've changed the base for variation's sake, and I've upped the photo amount, definitely. I want to get as much color and life into this material as possible. I want it to be very shiny, obviously, because it's a brushed metal and it's supposed to be shiny. Now on the gloss, here's where I'm going to start playing around with things. You can see here that it's not super glossy or anything, and it's kind of an average. I think I wanted a little bit more than that. So I'm going to start playing around with values of the layers in the gloss map only, and get it to some level that I enjoy, something that looks relatively close to some form of photo reference, something that looks cool. I don't know. I'm just going to start playing around with it. I'm going to drag in a photo here, get some unique detail into the specular, move around the photo, make it look a little bit less scaled. Like I had it at the same scale. So in this case, I've resized it just on the specular and moved it around so that it looks unique. And now, since this has a brush pattern in the photo, I'm going to select that area and I'm going to rotate it around so it fits the same flow as the filtered brush metal pattern that I was using earlier. And you can see there how I've placed it. I've got that unique, almost like a cloudy detail just around the edge. Usually when you are placing details and you don't know where to put something, either trash it and try a different detail, or try it around the edges. Because, think about it. That's where things get worn the most, is around the edges. So things usually look more natural there, where shapes look a lot more natural and full there, rather than just having them be somewhere on their own. You can see here, now that I've just added a little bit of unique detail on the specular, how much more active this looks. When it's in the light, it just looks so cool. And when it's not in the light, it just disappears and it goes away, and it's so active. It has so much life in it. It really does sell it more than you might think. So here I've upped the contrast of that photo and upped the saturation, and I think that looks a lot more cold, like the real thing. It definitely has that metal coldness to it, and that's what I really want to represent from this material. So here I'm just playing around with the shader a little bit, turning lights on and off, seeing how things look in the dark, I guess is the best way to say it. So now I'm just going to play around with the gloss level a little bit. I'm not too happy with the gloss level right now, So I'm just going to go ahead and change that around until I think it contrasts really well with the surrounding material that I have, which is just the soft touch plastic for now. Until I get the copper or brass or whatever it's going to be later, maybe that's not a spoiler at all, in next to it, in between, to separate the materials. And when I get the blade in, which will have a different tone and a different feeling overall to it, and it's going to definitely distinguish itself from this brush. Which, up next, because now I'm pretty happy with the brushed material overall, is going to be the brass and the trigger, which are going to be the same group. So starting off with just a selection and a mask to make things as clean as possible, so I can be as messy as possible underneath. I'm just going to make two subgroups for the trigger and the brass, both separate. The trigger one will be made in just a moment. I've made the brass one right now, and I put a blank layer with just a flat color on it. And brass acts kind of funny. It requires a very green, very dark diffuse map, definitely saturated. And on the specular map, it needs to be a moderately saturated yellow or an orange or something. It's a very strange material. It's often best to pull those colors directly from reference. On the trigger, however, we want a paint on top of a very rough metal. That's our material that we blocked out. It looks really cool. And because I don't have the photo anymore that I used for this paint, I'm just going to steal it right out of that concept image that I mocked up. Dirty, isn't it? I know. But it works. So, I've got the paint layer on top of the rough metal like it would actually be on the real thing, because we have the technology to do that now. And I'm using Blend If to get some kind of base grunge out. It just gives it some kind of starting texture, something. I don't know, anything. Now on the mask, what I've done is I've pulled some scrapes from that blue photo that you see in the background, and I've used that on the mask. And you can see here that adding that gives these super realistic edge wear spots. I'm going to need to paint over it a little bit, as you see here, to make it cleaner and less noisy in the areas where it wouldn't get grunged up. And paint down there on the bottom where it would get worn up, where the photo is not worn up. But anyway, using that photo as a mask is going to give us a shape down there. Just a starting shape that we can use. It might not be perfect, but as you can see here, painting over it really does make a world of difference. We can definitely get it the way we want it now. So now I'm moving around the rough metal underneath it, just so I can see how the shapes are underneath it, because it's a very contrasted rough metal underneath it. And it requires some specific placement so it looks right, because it has a defined, not random pattern underneath it, structured pattern. I've also gone ahead and made the paint darker compared to what it was, because I don't want the specular map making bright even brighter and making it look terrible. So that's why I made it dark. Now on these holes here, because they're not actually modeled in, I need to fake that by painting some black on the diffuse and the specular, so that it will give the appearance of depth without actually having any depth, because it's not modeled in. And I probably should have taken the time to model that in, but I think it's such a minuscule piece that's going to be covered by hands or whatever, or fingers, pulling the trigger. I think that the black circles will do the job good enough, that's for sure. Now I started the creation of the specular portion of these materials by duplicating the group and bringing them onto the specular. The first thing I'm going to do is start by defining the materials, which is going to involve me changing the hues of things and the lightness of things. Now, you can see also here, very specific note, because I was using blend if on the paint to get some of the base wear, the starting wear, now because I've darkened the underlying material, the blend ifs are now different. So the values have changed, and thus it's bringing out more of the underlying texture. It's kind of cool. You can use it to your advantage sometimes, that's for sure. And now I'm just setting up the brass material, which is going to take quite a lot of tweaking. It's definitely a stubborn material to get right. So next up, I'm just going to duplicate the brass and trigger layer group thing and put it onto the gloss and start tweaking that. One thing to note while I'm making these materials is that how these materials act in real life. Are they a dielectric or a conductor? You probably are thinking, what am I on about? He's a crazy person not making just the things, you know. Anyway, so dielectrics are things like plastics or woods or coatings that are not conductive, or plastics or fabrics. What did I say that? Anyway, so conductors, however, are things like metals, and they conduct. But the interesting thing to note about them is that now under, let's say, a white light, dielectrics will have a white highlight, whereas conductors will actually alter the color of the highlight. That's just how they act. Now, conductors can take the appearance of dielectrics if they're coated with anything. So, for example, let's say a metal object is coated with red paint, like we did on the trigger. So, well, yes, the underlying material will be a conductor. On top there is a dielectric, and so the material will have the appearance of a dielectric. Pretty obvious, right? But these are the things that we need to take in consideration when making these materials and blocking things out, is how the real material acts, and if it's a dielectric or a conductor. There's an article called A Brief Consideration About Materials. It's on 3D Total. I very, very strongly suggest you go take a look at it. It's a great read for everybody. The other way this ties into our specular map creation is because even today, most shaders are not written properly. Now in the video I'm just tweaking things, but this gives me time to explain another reason why this ties into creating our specular maps. Now even today, many shaders are not coded properly. So from an artist's perspective, because I'm not going to get too technical on here because you're probably going to get confused. I got really confused the first time I heard it. It's not a big deal. I'm just throwing that out there before I explain it. Most shaders do what I'm just going to call, for our sake, additive specular. What's going to happen is that when you add a white specular to a red material, for example, it's going to get a brighter red. Whereas on a gamma corrected shader, a white specular will give us a perfectly white highlight no matter what. This makes making materials so much easier, because on a incorrectly made shader, in order to get a white highlight, you need to invert the hue of your specular to get the white highlight. Now the most common example is wood, because that usually has a coating on it. When you want to have a brown wood and has a white coating on it, you need to invert the hue of the specular to get a bluish hue. And when that bluish hue is added to the brown diffuse, it gets a white coating and it looks like it's supposed to. Whereas on a gamma corrected shader, you just put white in the specular and it gets a white highlight. It's a lot easier for everybody, because in practice there are a lot more dielectric materials in the world than there are conductors. The 3-point shader for 3D Studio Max actually has an option to toggle gamma corrected and classic additive mode. And the gamma corrected mode really does look absolutely fantastic. But anyway, that's the explanation behind why I inverted the hue on the trigger paint. Now I've started to make the blade material. I've just started by doing the same thing I have for the rest of the materials. That's why I talked over it. And I've just chosen a random metal base and added a slight blue tint to it. It's going to probably go away later, but for now we'll leave it. Now my concept has lights coming out of these little ribs here, which looks awesome, but the problem is that since we're just using the 3D Studio Max default shader, there's no real option for any kind of glow. We're not using Unreal or anything fancy yet, so we're just going to end up using the Diffuse and the Specular and the another group that I'm going to make, which is going to be for self-illumination. And then afterwards, we're just going to use some Photoshop post and fake it. It's going to look fine for what we need. If you really want to take this to the next level, I mean, I could bring this into Unreal and I could make that actually look really good. But I'm not going to, because I don't have the time. I'm just going to fake it. It looks fine. So now here I made a group, which is going to be the Illumination Map, the self-illumination map. Usually this goes in an alpha of something, but we're just going to keep it as its own separate texture because that's what this shader uses. A little weird, but it'll do. Another thing to note is actually this shader does not support colored self-illumination maps, which is kind of odd, but whatever. We'll work with it. If I had a colored self-illumination map, I actually would be able to do without faking a lot of this stuff. I could just have the self-illumination map and do a little bit of diffuse tweaking, but for the majority, just have a colored illumination map that I could then use a hue saturation adjustment on and change the color to whatever I wanted it to be. Alternatively, if I was using Unreal or CryEngine or something, I could wire this thing up to some sort of value that I could use to change the color on the fly when it's toggled via code or something. I don't know, I'm not some kind of wizard or something, but it could be done very, very, very easily, and that would be the proper way to do it without having to fake all this nonsense. So now to get the glow in just these slots here, I'm using Blend If to make it blend into just the shadows. Because I have an AO map baked, this actually works relatively well for everything just being a fake at least, not being real self-illumination. It definitely works for what we need, right now at least. So I'm starting on the big shapes on the blade, the really cool wear shapes that I had from the concept that I made. Same photo, in fact, works well. Really cool shapes. It'll look awesome when it's scaled up and painted and really done up well in all the materials. It's in all the maps. It's gonna look great. The defining part about this material that I'm making for the blade is that it's a bare metal underneath, but it has a coating, and the coating is going to make it a little bit yellow, and it's going to really give a different look from the brushed. It's definitely going to stand out. So now right here I'm just using Blend If to get the big shape out of this section of the photo that I'm using. And because it's a little bit sparse near the teeth, which would get the most wear from, being hacked away at things all day, I'm going to just use a rough paintbrush on a new layer and sample the colors from the existing photo that we already have on here. And I'm just going to paint over. I'm going to make it a little bit more dense, play around with the opacities, get it to where I think it looks pretty nice and solid. This is a really good example right here. It looks nice and solid. There's this big worn area where the coating is completely worn away, but at the same time then there's that sparseness around the edges. It's not all on or all off. It's got that full range. It's not black and white. It's natural. It's got structure. It looks great. To make that a little bit more complete and make it more realistic, I'm sampling a similar area from the same photo, but it's more thin edges. And I'm just placing these edges on the rest of the blade, the parts that wouldn't necessarily get worn away as much as the serrated teeth that are being used for, I don't know, chopping wood or sawing or, I don't know, whatever else you'd use serrated teeth on a blade for. But the areas that would make contact with something that is being sliced up, something that's being contacted a lot but not quite as much as the rest. So we're going to make that thinner, less pronounced. We definitely want that big area to be accentuated, but we want the rest of the blade to have something. So that's what we're adding these for. You can see there are some weird hairline scrapes though, and those are definitely going to get edited out because they don't flow with the rest of the blade. They are going against the grain, I guess is the best way to say it. The blade is a very long horizontal piece, and having strange vertical scrapes going up and down it is breaking the overall flow of it. It won't look right. So away they go. And also I've kind of thinned out the scrapes towards the end, towards the very tip, because we're going to add in some more motiony scrapes from, let's say, the blade being used to pry up on something, or being stabbed into something, or, I don't know, something. We're just going to figure out how to place the photo here. You could use a wireframe overlay if you export that out from your Max UV editor or Textporter or the text tools that I was showing earlier. You can export that from one of those, your favorite editor of that kind of thing, and overlay it on top of your diffuse so you would know exactly where to place it without having to fiddle around with it. But I've gotten pretty good at fiddling around with these things, so I can just kind of eyeball it and get it pretty close. Usually I'm using things to judge distance here. So here I'm just using the little edge here, seeing how it lines up. It's not that bad. It's pretty close. I guess it needs to be shifted over a little bit. And up, definitely, for sure. So it's not quite on the edge of the blade, rather as it is on the surface of the blade, the flat surface that would be used to pry up things, rather than the edge which would be used to cut. I'm probably not making a whole lot of sense, but trust me, it's going to be very, very obvious if you just watch the video and stop listening to me distract you here. Now, another interesting thing I like to do is I like to use the replace color and the selective color adjustments and the select tool that does the same thing, the image range selection tool, to get just select areas that would be too hard or impossible to manually select. So, for example, the gray surfaces on this scraped up piece of metal, the gray big surface would be impossible to manually select, and very hard to use blend if to get out. So to make that a little easier, I'm using selective color here, or replace color, to make those areas much darker so I can use blend if to blend them out, and thus giving me this scrape pattern. And I'm just going to paint out some of the longer scrapes so they mesh a little better. They're not so defined. I don't want them as defined as the big scrapes. Later on, I think I'm going to even remove these from the diffuse mask that I'm going to make from this. Spoilers. And see, that looks not bad. That's not bad at all. It's going to definitely look cool when we make our mask. Spoilers from these patterns that we've generated using the photos. Now, I'm moving around layers here because this is now the time to generate that mask, the spoiler mask. That's the new name for it, the spoiler mask. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the scrapes layers, I'm going to duplicate them, and I move them all the way to the top, and then I'm going to put a black background underneath it, and I'm going to use Control A and then Control Shift C to copy merged. Then I'll place that in my, we'll say, coating layers mask. And then underneath that coating layer, we're going to use this photo of raw metal and put that just underneath our coating. And so our coating is going to be a solid, whereas then we'll have this rough metal underneath our coating, and it'll look really nice once we've set up all the maps, of course. And you can see here now that I've added my hacky looking mask to the coating layer, now we have this flat bluish metal looking layer, and it's going over this raw metal layer, and it looks pretty cool. So we're just gonna save everything out and see how that looks real quick. Get a kind of an idea of what this is gonna look like in the end once we've set up everything. Right, so now I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to remove some of the weird looking shapes. Definitely play around with the blade, getting that more defined, some of these angles, these hard angles that I have modeled in here. And I'm going to play around also with removing some of these big long scrapes, like the ones you see up here that I'm currently painting out. They don't flow that well. They're just kind of there filling those blank spaces up, and they don't give anywhere for their eye to rest. It's not cool. We're probably gonna do something with those areas later, but no spoilers anymore. I'm done with that. Anyway, so the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to accentuate my edges using what's known as I'm using air quotes here, cavity map, which is generated from the normal map. This is definitely a very hacky thing, but it actually works kind of well. There's a script in Endu, or there's a plugin in Xnormal that comes with Xnormal, installs in Photoshop, that allows you to very quickly make this. After you make it, you should get white on your edges, your model's edges, and if you don't, you need to invert your normal map's green channel before you generate it. Then you can use levels like I just did to make pretty much the only thing showing is the black background and then the white edges on the map. Then you can use screen and overlay that on your specular map later and your gloss map, and that'll accentuate your edges. It'll make them pop more. I mean, you modeled all of those on your high poly for a reason. You should show them off. Now I'm just tweaking the diffuse map for my blade to make it play well with the future gloss and specular maps that I will make in just a moment. You can see here that now the bare metal is darker, which should make it stand out a little bit more once I make the gloss and specular, which I'm about to do. I've just duplicated the group, put it into the specular. I'm putting it in the right order first, the right layer order, and I've got to modify some of my existing block out layers that I use to block out the materials. And I'm just merging everything together, deleting old legacy layers that I don't need anymore, things that are going to be replaced in the near future. So now I've got what looks pretty much like my original blockout layer on the specular map, but instead now we've added a mask to it, which is the mask from our diffuse. And you can see that I'm just playing around with the contrast, getting it to show a little bit more of the underlying bare metal. Now I'm just duplicating that, and I'm going to put it on the gloss map. The blade, I think, is going to end up being very glossy, whereas the bare metal is going to look pretty flat, because I mean it's a bare metal. It's going to be pretty rough. It's going to look fairly flat. And what I'm doing right now is I'm actually replacing the metal base that I was using for the diffuse and the specular, I believe. I'm replacing it with a different metal base for variation. and I just replaced that by making a new pattern fill layer with the base I wanted, and then dragging the old mask that is from the specular layer that I duplicated. Just dragging that and replacing the existing mask with it, and there you have it. Then I rasterized the pattern fill layer and just increased the contrast of it to make it show a little bit more when the light hits the surface. And you can definitely see right here that this is definitely the start of a nice material that we've made up. It looks absolutely solid in the light. It definitely will look a lot better once it's finished, obviously, but it is looking pretty nice now. I've just increased the brightness of the bare metal on the specular. I don't know how I'm going to keep that. I don't know if I'm going to make it darker again, or if I'm going to keep that or make it a little more contrasty. I'm not quite sure yet. So here I'm just poking around, playing with the light. I'm just seeing where I'm going to go next. I'm just going to do some shape tweaking. And through the magic of editing, you can see that I've cleaned up the shapes a little bit more. I've tweaked the materials out a little bit. I've gotten them the way I want it to be. There's some things I still am not quite happy about. For example, how sparse this last tooth is. It looks natural, but it looks lonely, so I'm just going to paint a little bit more. And also remove some of the excess scrapes that are around here. I cleaned up the bottom edge underneath these here, the glowy bits, I guess is the best way to say it. Because, I mean, think about it, that's rarely ever going to get hit by anything. It's rarely going to come into contact. The rest of the blade is what's going to really hit things. The area next to the handguard really shouldn't get nearly as worn as the rest of it. And again, this is another really crucial piece of logic that you should really be thinking about when you're placing your damaged shapes, and it should be common sense. But hey, you never know these days, huh? Anyway, so I removed this scrape from pretty much every map except for the specular, but I think it still is breaking the flow. It's definitely going against the grain of our sword here. Let's remove it. And while we're at it, why don't we send this texture to some people and get some feedback? That's important. So what I've gathered from the feedback from the people that I've sent this image is that the brass was heavily breaking the flow because it was too yellow. And so the yellow was not meshing with the red very well. I changed that to a copper, and now it looks a lot nicer. I added some very, very minor fine detail, but other than that, the shader is really what's gotten played around with the most. I've not added any kind of dirt yet, so let's go ahead and do that. I've dragged this photo of sand in that I grabbed from the Mayang texture library, and that's what I use for my mask. Then what I have is I have a script that does pretty much all the steps for me. I'll walk you through them in a moment. What it does is it duplicates the AO, then it colorizes it, so it makes all of the dark areas on the model brown, as you can see there. Definitely a big difference. Get some nice colors where the shadows are. Then what it does is it uses blend if to only show those brown areas. So I'm just going to go through these steps. I've duplicated the AO map. Then I've set the layer style to normal. And I'm just reordering this so that the layer is on the very top so I can edit it without any interference. Now I'm going to image adjustments, hue saturation. I am pressing the colorize tick box, and I am playing around until I get a brownish hue. Then I'm going to use blend if. Then I'm going to use blend if to make it only show the dirty areas. And then after that I can add a mask. I can change the opacity down like so. But I'm just going to delete the layer that we manually created, and I'm going to remake it using my automated method. It's very consistent, very, very easy to do. if you don't know how to make this into an automated action, it's extremely simple. I usually do this when I'm just starting on my textures because it gets a good amount of detail in evenly, but in this case I decided to do it last. I don't know why, just for whatever. Now what I did is I alt-clicked on the layer mask for my dirt layer, and I just dragged in my sand photo. Now I'm going to scale it down so it's pretty much noise. You notice how I said pretty much, because it's noise, but the thing is it has structure. Which, if you read the article that went along with this thing that I wrote, I put all this effort into, then you know what that means. Now I'm just leveling it so it's a little bit more sparse, not so full on. One thing you can see, well, you can see it now, is that I've increased the layer opacity up pretty high so I can see what I'm doing. Now I'm just going to take some grunge brushes and I'm going to paint out some dumb looking areas on the mask. I'm going to remove areas that have too much dirt or just don't look right, as well as adding some cloudier, some bigger shapes to make it look even dirtier, not so full on all the time here. So down here, some of these inverse areas, they don't really make a whole lot of sense why there's any dirt here. And also by this handguard, having it full on all the time looks a little silly, so I'm going to use my grunge brush to make it a little bit less regular, make it broken up some more. Just make it less full on. I'm going to say that a lot more. In the trigger, I'm just going to add it in the very corners, which would get the most dirt, because in those crevices, you wouldn't easily be able to clean those out. It's the same reason why big flat areas don't usually get as much dirt as the crevices, because dirt will collect in those little crevices and they're going to be very hard to clean, whereas the big flat surfaces you just kind of wipe down. And they're going to get cleared off from just regular use, unlike the little crevices. What I'm doing right now is I'm changing the blend mode on the gloss, and also I did it on the specular, is that because dirt is completely matte, there's pretty much no specularity to it at all, it is represented that way. So on the gloss, I've made it, well, some debate on this subject, but I made it dark. And on the specular, I made it completely dark, so there's completely, absolutely no light being caught there. And why I said that it is debatable is because a lot of people like to make the AO map inverted on the gloss map, because then it's going to be super glossy and not catch any highlights. I've done that on multiple occasions. It's really a good idea, but in this case, I decided that I'd represent them a little bit more accurately, and instead just have them darker. And instead on the specular map, I just make it completely black so no light is hitting them at all. Now the little copper area underneath the handguard, like between the grip and the handguard, it is not helping the depth of the model any, because it's pretty bright. So what I decided to do is try and give that area some more depth by just adding a shadow there. It's kind of fake looking, but it does the job. It's so subtle that I don't think it's gonna matter too much. Yeah, you can barely see it, but when it's not in the light, it gives it a little bit more depth, which is what it's supposed to do. I'm gonna duplicate this and put it on the specular map just to give it a little bit more power to it. Not a whole lot. I actually think that looks kind of cool. So yeah, I really like that. For the copper, I actually just used a photo that I took of a copper heatsink. I overlaid it onto the specular map. I think it looks really nice. Now, I'm sorry for not showing you that, but you should know how to do that by now. Here's the final result. I'm pretty pleased with it. The shader setup is nothing fancy at all. It's just Q map reflections, an IBL Q map for ambient lighting, 3 lights, pretty minor. Gloss map is all set up the way I wanted it to, just playing around with some of the sliders. Works really nice in the light, definitely works great with the reflections. So here's my 3-point light setup. Nothing fancy at all. These materials work great with just one Omni or even just IBL Q maps. I'm pretty happy with these materials, the way they all came out. It looks pretty great. They play well with the light. Lots of great colors, lots of unique detail. So hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot from it. Thanks to NextGenHardSurface.com for hosting this video. You know who I am. I'm gonna go dodge some bullets. Goodbye. You ain't up if you don't play shmups. Guys, we have an epidemic on our hands. They're replacing all the good games from our arcades and replacing them with horrible ones. I mean, that initial D V4 is gone. The Outrun 2 is gone. One of the best games of all time. There's no Daytona USA 2 around here. No Scud Race. And I mean, you know what they're replacing them with? Raw Thrills. Raw Thrills. Those games are garbage. And I mean, now they're taking our Bimani machines. I mean, that Extreme, that's a Namco bootleg now. And the In the Groove 2, you know it's going to be out of there. What are they going to do next? Force us to play some disgrace like Big Buck